So I was asked to talk about something about some of the more practical aspects of running different sorts of studies. And I was thinking about what was interesting to me that had changed over the last time period. And actually it's this trying to work with routine data, which I thought would be quite interesting. I'm not going to talk about lots of statistical approaches to that. It's far more about the practicalities of trying to use routine data. I said some of those are also GP specific, some aren't. So one of the challenges we have, and I've just come from an NIHR meeting where Tom Wally says we're costing too much as trials, and therefore we have to look at ways of getting cheaper, and routine data is currently seen as the panacea which will solve that problem. However, there are a number of other issues for us. That includes the fact that people who go into studies are often a very selected bunch. If there was some way to look more generally at the population, we might have more generalizable studies. We have quite a heavy data collection burden on staff. Co-intervention effects, Toby mentioned those in terms of data collection. Loss to follow-up. I think in Toby's talk he said we try and keep it above 80%. And I'm like, even that is actually potentially quite biasing. And it's very, very common, and we just accept it. So I think there's things we need to think about there. And then also some of the issues around modelling real-life impact and very long-term follow-up. So those are some of the challenges that I, as a statistician, regularly get thrown at me when we talk about the design of our studies and how that then can have an impact and what it all means at the end, and particularly from reviewers of papers. You haven't dealt with this yet. Okay. But I also think that for the entirety of my career, so I've worked in primary care for 20 years, maybe a little bit more, 20 odd years. And for all of that time, we've been talking about the magic single patient electronic record. I would say when I started working in primary care, I used to go and visit GP practices, and if they had a computer, it was often sitting in the corner covered in dust. So we have come a very long way. But one of the key things in that list that we had been promised for years was the accessibility to researchers and the ability to link to research data. And I think that's been one of the things we've been promised for a very, very long time. So what I'm just going to run through, it's not quite 15 years, it's 10, is a couple of examples of studies over the last 10 years where we've tried to do things and what we have and haven't been able to do. So we can have a kind of see how things have developed, and I'm hopefully going to finish with a couple of ideas of where we might be going in the future. So 10 years ago, I did a trial called STAR. So this, I suddenly realised wouldn't have come up in your search strategy because I called it a practice-based randomised control trial. So this was a randomised trial where we trained GPs to approach prescribing antibiotics differently. The primary outcome data was all routine data. We had no patient recruitment. Okay, so there was no patient recruitment in this at all. We just got the total, we were aiming to get their total antibiotic prescribing over the next time period after we trained them. So I don't expect you to be able to read the flow diagram, it was just kind of to show that we had one. And we had 68 practices who took part in this study. So we had then, these are Welsh data sources, sorry if the acronyms don't look quite the same as what you'd expect in England. 3 different data sets which we had to access data from those practices, and we had practice permission and agreement to get that data. So we had, I thought I'd change that. So it was actually dispensing data by practice. That's going to be one of my points later on, is reflecting the understanding of the difference. So this is essentially the reimbursement for prescriptions to pharmacies data, but it's linked to which practice prescribed it. So it means the patient went and got their script for antibiotic filled. It doesn't actually mean the GP wrote that. Isn't every script the GP wrote. We had hospital data from something called PEDI, and then we obviously needed some way of looking at the patient population, so we had list sizes from another data set, monthly list sizes, which was an interesting cleaning experience. So from those, we could get our primary outcome, which was antibiotic prescribing rates, and we were overall looking to see it being reduced in total. And we could also get one of our key secondary outcomes, which was hospitalisation rates, which was looking at safety. So were we safely reducing antibiotic prescribing? However, we had also got a particular target condition, which was respiratory tract infections, where we knew there was huge overusage of antibiotics, and we wanted to look at prescribing rates for those and reconsultation rates for those. So this was supposed to be achieved by going to the practice systems and being able to get the information on consultation coding to know that someone had a respiratory tract infection, and also to look at reconsultation to see if they came back within a set time period. So just to pick up on that a little bit, on how that was done, the intention was, we wrote a program, we gave it to the practices, they could run it on their system. 68 practices, quite simple and easy, not complex programming. Only Vision and Ganymede, which people might, if you're older you might have heard of it, but I don't think it gets used anymore, system, so that was about half of our practices, would actually allow us, EMIS wouldn't allow us to integrate our little program with their system. So that cut in half the number of practices we could use, and then the practices couldn't do it themselves. They kept waving their hands in the air and saying it didn't work. So that meant we had to send people out on at least 2 occasions to 37 practices, and then probably on more occasions because they'd turn up and it wasn't convenient and someone was worried about doing it while patients were being seen because you might affect the whole system. And yeah. And the key point was the only data that left the practice was summary data. That was the only thing we could get approval for. So what would leave the practice was the number of respiratory tract infection consultations, the number of those that had an antibiotic. So we were taking away no individual level patient data, and that was what we could get approvals for 10 years ago. So in terms of those things that I said were a challenge, we did actually manage to deal with a lot of those in that study. One of the good points about it, but one of the challenging debates when we were trying to get it published, was we showed a 4% reduction in antibiotic dispensing in total. And everyone went, that's not clinically relevant. All the previous studies have shown 10% reductions in antibiotic prescribing. And we're like, yes, they selected patients. We didn't. On average, entire practices have reduced their overall use of antibiotics by 4%. That's far more meaningful. That took quite a debate. But as I said, we actually did quite a cheap study. I know it was 10 years ago, but it cost about 300k, and that included the entire design of the training intervention for the GPs and a reasonable sized qualitative study alongside. So, not bad in terms of expense. And we got everybody. We didn't have the GPs, as we were talking about before, knowing what group they were in, selecting the patients that they decided to put into the study. So we did well on all of those things. But actually we had very limited data. So we did only really have a handful of data items at the end of the study. Very efficient, it answered the main question, but there's always then some odd patterns. So when we looked at particular antibiotics, you go, oh, it'd be nice to explore that a bit more. There seemed to be a trading between those 2 antibiotics, one went up a bit and one went down a bit. And we didn't have any of that more data. So from an analyst perspective, it's a little bit frustrating because you can only go so far. But it did answer the main question. We still didn't manage to do the long-term follow-up because that, again, would have been more resource intensive than we could have done. And it became clear from our subsidiary qualitative study that we needed to think very carefully about intervention effects on coding behaviour. So GPs were very happy to admit that if they thought the patient in front of them needed an antibiotic, they might change their code because we told them that you shouldn't, for example, prescribe for sore throats. But it kind of was okay if they had tonsillitis with pus on their tonsils. So they might go, actually, I'm going to give this patient an antibiotic. You've told me it's bad to do it that way, so I'll call it that. So it's very clear that you can have intervention effects on coding behaviour. So I think that's a key one for us to remember. And obviously we had this challenge with only being able to get about half of our practices because we had to go out and get it from their systems, and we had a problem with EMIS. So I'm then going to move on to a study that we did 5 years ago. Now this is quite a different study, but I think I've picked this one because it's got some very interesting components. I should say before we start talking about this, we didn't recruit from primary care. We recruited from community midwifery teams, and then we came back to GP practices at a later point, and that will be key. So this is a large-scale evaluation in England, so move country as well, of 1,600 essentially teenagers who are pregnant with their first child. So we wanted to use routine data for our primary outcomes in this study. We did lots of other data collection that was direct contact with the patients to get that. because we know this is a very mobile group, they're hard to follow up. So it's a classic one where you think you've done a good job if you get 60% follow-up in this population. So we wanted to make sure we used routine data to maximise and reduce that problem. And I'm just going to pick up on one of those outcomes. We had 4, which we're all appropriately corrected for. I'm not talking about that right now. Which is subsequent pregnancy within 2 years, which was one of our areas where we wanted to look at data collection. So we wanted to know if someone had had another pregnancy 2 years in the first 2 years after their child was born. They could have had a miscarriage, they could have had a termination, they could have had a live birth. They could still be pregnant at the end of the 2-year follow-up, but that's what we were interested in. We had self-report data in that we tried to speak to every woman every 6 months. And then we also had data from GP records, what was HSCIC, which has all the hospital data in it. And we also managed to get directly from the Department of Health their abortions data set. Now, abortions are a reportable procedure, and therefore, on regulatory terms, they have to be held in this central single data set. So we felt that was a good one to get. However, what was quite interesting was that we seem to have very different rates in these different things. And to a certain degree, you might say that's expected. They would pick up different things. You know, if a woman has a very early miscarriage, it might never get very far into secondary care. You know, the abortions data is just abortions. So we've got data from all of these areas. You can see we've got just below 10% of the women look like they've had an abortion in the following 2 years. The maternal self-report is affected by loss to follow-up, which you can see. The GP records are affected by loss to follow-up as well. That's because predominantly either GPs just said no, they wouldn't give us the data. Their most common reason was that we took consent 2.5 years earlier when they entered the study, and they didn't think that was still valid, and if we wanted them to give any patient records, then we had to go back and get further consent from everybody. Which, since we wanted the routine records predominantly for people we couldn't follow up, wasn't an ideal approach. So we had a real gatekeeping issue with the GPs. I would say that this was at a similar point of time as care.data was starting, and there was a lot of issues being discussed around the gatekeeper role of GPs to data. However, in terms of the other data sources, in terms of matching, finding people, we only lost 7 through not being able to match. So we actually managed to do a lot of the following up. However, if we look at what the rate of second pregnancy was, if you take evidence of a second pregnancy in any of those data sources, we came in at 66%, which most people would acknowledge was very high. And there were some people who were coming back to me going, you must have made a mistake. All the reported ones in the literature are lower than that. But they have generally only taken one source. So I think that's quite a key thing for us to think about. So the main results for this showed no effect of the intervention on this outcome. So we can see that it was 66.3% in one arm and 66.1% in the other arm. Absolutely no effect. However, if we took some of those other data sources and just used the information from those data sources, particularly the second and third lines here, you can see that whilst they were still not significant because the confidence intervals were quite wide, maternal self-report and GP records gave different effects in a different direction. And I think this is something that we need to spend a bit more time thinking about in terms of using routine data, is how it gets there and what biases are in its presence. We still spend a lot of time kind of assuming that if it's not in the record, it didn't happen. And I think that's a real question mark over a lot of studies where we're using routine data. And it's what we wouldn't be prepared to make that assumption if we prospectively collected the data. So this is me just reflecting again on how I think we did. So I think we dealt with the bits in green. I think this really helped us with. We did manage to follow people up for 2.5 years in a challenging population. And we had a good follow-up. We ended up with 96% of the sample with data for those routine data primary outcomes, with only a 65% follow-up for the telephone. So in terms of going from self-report up to that, we hugely improved that. The top end, to be honest, we didn't really deal with because there was all those other aspects of data collection, so it was still quite an expensive study. It did cost £5 million. But what comes out of this is some of those really interesting challenges, but they're also interests of having all these multiple data sources on the same outcomes. And there's lots more that I want us to be looking at more in that. The other aspect that I just wanted to mention, which I think comes out in this particular clinical area, is whilst we talk about routine data as being comprehensive, and maybe that's GP but also whole health, and we do have a comprehensive health service, there are components of health that are traditionally not delivered through the NHS. So the majority of abortions are not done in the NHS. So that's a particular example where we do have a data set that we can refer back to that's regulatory required. But similarly, family planning, a number of other areas are not necessarily done there. So some care is needed to understand whether you would have all of those items in your data sets. We still needed to go to individual GP practices to get data. We had the promise throughout this entire study that something called the GP extraction service would work and we could get data for research. Didn't happen. And it took 18 months time lag to get the data. Well, time lag to get the data from approval. We also had care.data explode as we were getting data, so it actually took another 15 months to get approval to be allowed to have the data. So I'm just going to, sorry, I realise I'm between you and coffee, I'm just going to move on to kind of a slight reality now, which is using that same sample, we've now got funding to do a long-term follow-up. So we're trying to go to the child's 6th birthday. And the reason for this is specifically to look at maltreatment and neglect. And so we've been funded to do solely data linkage, so it's now no face-to-face, none of that. And we're looking at associated measures of maltreatment. So for this, we then had to look, and you'll notice that GP data has disappeared because we still can't get directly into GP data, and we can't keep trying to track where these people have gone in terms of their GP. We've actually decided that we're not going to get GP data this time, unless suddenly it becomes available. I think that's a real shame as someone who's spent my whole life working in primary care, or working life anyway. But we are linking into education data, which holds some of the information we would have wanted from GP data. So it has whether the child has any designation of child in need, what subclassifications that are, whether that's caused by disability, whether it's caused by other perceptions of risk, and what those risk factors are. So we're actually trying to match across to there. I'm going to put up a couple of slides now, not to talk about in detail, but to describe a little bit about the fact that it's still not a simple process. I don't know about the rest of you, but I certainly get the sense that, well, all this cost of trials is just collecting data. So if it's already there, it's quite easy. It's just, you just go and analyse it. So this is the data safe haven and approvals structure for this particular follow-up study. We have 3 different sets of approvals for data. We have a Section 251 approval because we wanted to do long-term follow-up without going back for consent again. Okay, so that allows us to do that. And for that, we have to make a justification, which is based on the fact that people who are neglecting their children are unlikely to give us consent to specifically look at their records in the long-term follow-up. And that's just a slightly more complex diagram of all the processes and systems we have to go through in order to be allowed to put that data into a data safe haven to do what we need to do. So it's complex. I'm just going to mention a little bit about the fact that we did have to put in an opt-out procedure in order to be able to justify this not going back to everyone for consent. Current data protection proposal changes from 2018 would make this illegal, and we would have had to have gone back and got consent. So there are some interesting regulatory discussions on the horizon that we need to have a conversation about. But this involved us writing to everybody who their last address we had, following it through, and so this was in just over 1,500 young women. We sent letters, texts and emails. You can see a nice little diagram that says how many got all of them, and from all of that, 7 people dissented. We did have quite a few more phone calls from people who said, "What is this? Can you tell me more about it?" but didn't talk about opt-out. So this does actually give us quite a good way to do a cheaper follow-up. This would be a far more expensive follow-up than it is, but it's not as cheap as people might have thought. the time and work associated with being able to develop your safe haven and also do all those regulatory approvals is a shifting work balance. So it took some convincing early on that we needed to put some of those things in, and I'm glad we did. We still have this challenge, which is the multiple data sources, and the fact that some things happen outside the NHS. We're hoping data is going to flow faster again now that HSCIC has rebranded as NHS Digital and has resolved, I've seen a presentation from the head of it this morning, resolved all of their issues. But I still think there's quite a lot of questions that we need to think about, and I am still gutted that we can't get GP data. I think this is given that actually GPs were further ahead in making all their records electronic, the fact that we're so challenged with able to access them for research, I think is a real issue. But there is quite a lot of potential, and the last couple of slides before you get to go and have coffee. However, care.data does mean we have a lot of relationships to build with the general public. I still look at those diagrams which are supposed to reassure and give consideration that we have an appropriate security model for data, and don't quite know how I would explain that to my dad, who gets involved as a patient in lots of research, for example. So we need to develop a way of helping them to understand what safeguards we put in place, and hopefully have a dialogue between what's needed and what's not, because it's currently pretty excessive. But we also need to develop the public perception of the value of the research we do. So a classic example, when the care.data example kicked off and there was news stories and they picked out of HSCIC some of the data sets they'd given without consent and some of the CAG approvals. And one was from some of our collaborators in Cardiff University, and it was shock horror. This group in Cardiff University got all this data without consent. And I can remember being asked about it by a layperson at a meeting, and I said, well, they're looking at whether there's patterns of attendance that would better identify and predict earlier kids who are being maltreated. And they went, oh, that's so important, and you can't ask for consent for that. And I'm like, no. Those sorts of things, we can get the message across if we take the time to. So I think we can use routinely collected health data for a lot of things that are facing us, but there are still an awful lot of challenges, and a lot of them are regulatory and practical. There are developing opportunities to nest trials in large consented cohorts. So Scotland has something called SHARE with 150,000 consented patients. They've already provided some questionnaire data, demographic data, and you can access their records. We're developing something similar in Wales called Healthwise Wales, and those might provide real opportunities if we can see whether or not they affect the selection bias to our studies. However, I think there's a bit of a research agenda to be done. We need to think about data quality and data retention. Some of that is a debate with regulators, but we also need to think about where there is good quality data and where there isn't. We need to think about why data is collected, the purpose it was collected for, and the coding behaviours. So those of us who prospectively design trials and go and train people how to collect data and what's really important and how they should do it, it's just their routine day. How do they do it? Why do they use that code? We also, one of the things that isn't talked about so much when you see stuff presented from the hospital episode statistic is that they actually, database, they also have millions of episodes that they never ever match to anybody. And that is something that I think we should be thinking about. So we say we want all these people who've got this, but actually there's millions of attendances in the NHS which they don't manage to match to a record. And those sort of missings and mismatches and reasons for that need a bit more thought and understanding so we can model appropriately. And then we have this residual issue with the NHS record or the complete health record, which we need to look at in different sources. But that last one might become a bigger issue as we get fragmentation of the delivery of health services. So the more private entities that are delivering, and if we come back again to the example, it wasn't a research example, when we had problems with a certain type of breast implant in the health service, the privately done procedures did not keep the records that the NHS would have done. So if we were doing research in those sorts of areas, we would be struggling again if we went to routine data. So I'm going to stop there because everyone wants coffee.